Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here with Wyatt Claypool of the National Telegraph, and we have another podcast. We're going to touch on very many things today: Trump, abortion, possibly BC United, many other things.
Been a busy week. Like oddly enough, for not that actual much stuff going on, it's been a busy week in the sense that the narratives and the issues that keep getting popular or have gotten popular this last week are like very strange and they usually don't get talked about. So, but I think it's all very indicative of the position that we're currently in Canadian politics of the desperation of Trudeau and also a good explainer on why oftentimes hot political rhetoric isn't always the best way of battling back.
Mm. Yeah, so as any longtime viewers of either of our channels would know, the Liberals are doing really bad right now. They're plummeting in the polls. The current polling average, the most recent polls are having like 23, 24%. Pretty terrible. Like 20-point leads for the Conservatives here. And what's remarkable about this isn't that the Liberals are sitting down and thinking, how should we address this? How should we fix this up? They just keep doubling down on all their favorite little wedge issues that they've been using since at least 2019, if not earlier. And one of the most interesting ones that I've seen pop up again recently, because I think there was some conservative MPs at some pro-life thing or something. I don't know. Happens on a regular basis. Not really much news to say that. But the Liberals are going really hard into campaigning on abortion again. Really trying to hit that the Conservatives are going to take abortion away or whatever. Curtail it. They're going to pass laws against it. And what makes this interesting isn't that they're talking about this. That's just predictable, right? It's that they don't understand the liberal comms teams, liberal strategy teams, what they're actually doing. They're just kind of going through the motions here, thinking that it's doing something, that this is the thing they need to do. But in reality, you don't campaign on these things. No one actually really is driven that much by abortion. There's actually a really big false narrative in the US since 2022 that Roe is why they've done so poorly in a lot of elections, the GOP that is. It's not true. It's unrelated. The GOP does bad in a lot of elections because they either didn't want to win or they're just wildly incompetent. And those are two separate things. They sometimes don't want to win, and sometimes they're wildly incompetent.
It's
It's
very
not.
infrequently that any election really comes down to, oh, it was that issue.
Mm,
Oftentimes, the issue, if there is an issue, it's the personality of the candidate on the ballot that is turning people off. So I think in the different U.S. Senate races, there was obvious candidate flaws for the Republicans with Herschel Walker in Georgia, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, and I think Blake Masters in Arizona is probably a good candidate, but that was an example of infighting in the Republicans, where I think that guy was running on a budget of like $8 million against Mark Kelly with $85 million.
yeah, another really good example that people bring up is the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which is technically a nonpartisan race, but nonpartisan races are just partisan races with a poster over the name. But in that race, the Republican affiliated guy, I can't think of his name, got trounced by the Democrat affiliated woman who I can't remember the name of. And people are like, oh, it's abortion because the Democrat woman basically ran entirely on abortion. But the underlying problem is that the Republican guy just ran a terrible campaign. Like, just genuinely bad. There was no upside in how his campaign was run. And it's not like this is like a one-off. This guy's run several bad campaigns before. He was a bad candidate.
And what we also keep asserting in every episode of the show that we do, plus your regular show, is that a bad candidate also is not a radical candidate, or they had policies that people didn't like. Oftentimes, it is purely personality based. Because in American and Canadian politics, if you're even somewhat in the mainstream, you can win a race if you're good at campaigning. A lot of the times when these guys are losing, it's because they come off like somebody you wouldn't give your wallet to. It's somebody who is too distracted with basically playing to the base or Trump, and then they end up losing just simply because they don't have they never reached out to the middle class. It's not because they didn't run on the right policies. That's an Aaron O'Toole way of thinking about politics. Oh, if we have the right policies, people will flock to us. It's like, no, you got to talk to those people in terms they understand. Not that they are foolish and you need to like slow things down for them. But you have to what am I trying to say here? Like you have to be able to actually explain how your policy playbook will end up positively affecting them.
Yeah. And that's where the liberals pulling out wedge issues like abortion coming in really betrays a entire misunderstanding of what you're trying to do as a campaign, as a political party. Because the idea about these wedge issue politics, and don't be clear, wedge issues do have uses and they're not like a write-off, but you have to use them very intelligently. Just saying they're going to do this doesn't, that might even be true. It could even be a legitimate circumstance. Like, let's say in the US, the Democrats could say the Republicans are going to restrict abortion. That's almost certainly true. Like, anyone who doesn't think that's a possibility is, I don't know, that you're just wrong. It is a possibility. But that doesn't actually mean it's an effective wedge, because you have to think about who this group is wedging. And you have to think about what these voters actually care about. Because for a wedge to matter, it has to actually be an issue that people care about in this particular moment. Even if overwhelmingly everyone supports this thing, that doesn't mean people are actually going to be wedged by it, if that makes sense. So let's pick an example in Canada. If you were to try to say, make a wedge issue about Canadians are nice people, which is the weird one, but just go with it. Most Canadians think that Canadians are nice people, so that wedge is not going to do anything. You'd be like, this he's a mean Canadian. It's like, that's not really a factor. That's not a thing that will drive people. Something that might drive people would be like the carbon tax that Poilievre's running. And there, the wedge issue matters, because the underlying thing here with a wedge is it has to be an issue that's not already polarized. As soon as it's a polarized issue like abortion is, where the pro-abortion people are voting liberal and the pro-choice people, the pro-life people are voting conservative, that wedge issue no longer does anything. You've already wedged it. You have cleaved the stone. It's done. It's useless now. It doesn't do anything. Continuing to talk about it actually just hurts your position more.
Especially when you don't have the political clout to actually be broaching the topic. And that's the biggest thing for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. People don't like them. And when people don't like you, they don't want you being the guy who stands up in the town hall and starts bringing up the most controversial issues. Everyone just thinks like, oh, goodness, this guy, why is he bringing up abortion? And I think we would both agree, if anything, this is going to make Canadians far more pro-life. It's like when Justin Trudeau took a swing at Donald Trump, or he has been, and trying to compare Pierre Poilievre to him. When your approval rating is only around of people who actually like you, not this kind of silly way of pulling approval where people somewhat like you. It's either they like you or they don't. When Abacus is showing only about 25, sometimes just 24% of Canadians like Justin Trudeau, him attacking Poilievre as Trump, or him talking about abortion, or honestly, even him bringing up LGBTQ issues, it just makes people take the opposite position of him, no matter how much the conventional wisdom on that issue is that people don't want it talked about because they are fine with the status quo.
Yeah, and there's two things with that too that I think a lot of people really don't understand, is that even in a group setting, I'll just use a personal example. My fiance has been going to RCAA. She's becoming a Catholic. And one of the sessions in RCAA is talking about Catholic social teachings, and one of which is obviously being pro-life. And even in a room where everyone is there who is a committed Catholic or wants to become one, that is an awkward conversation to have that no one really wants to have, even though everyone already agrees with each other. And then you bring that into a setting where you don't have people who have very strong moral convictions on issue. They don't already agree with the issue. And most people who have no strong opinion on, say, abortion, literally don't want to talk about it. And talking about it actually makes them really alienated and feel awkward and want to leave. Because it's a very distasteful thing to talk about, regardless of whether you support it or not.
You always have to talk about the issue like you're on some sort of bank heist. You are in and out on the issue as fast as possible and make it the other side seem as weird as possible for their position. So as like a pro-lifer, it's like honestly the best tactic is just like, I don't know why these guys think sex-selective abortion is right. That's obviously just insane. And then you move on. And it's like, the person's like, yeah, it is kind of insane. But if you keep talking about it, they don't want to join a club. They don't want to join your pro-life club locally. They just want to hear what you have to say, sounds reasonable, and it will be one of the various baked in reasons why they might be choosing you as a candidate. You're never trying to make someone, and this is a mistake. In nominations, it makes sense. But in actual general elections, I don't need you to be a pro life voter. I just need you to be a voter. And so it just needs to be one of the 35 reasons why you ended up voting for me. And we just need you to be on side enough that if I do something on that issue, that you're not going to be surprised and then turn on me later. That's all you're really looking for. So many issues. There's not that much comms on them. But when the party in power acts on those, people aren't like, well, why would they do that? Because the person said enough around that topic that you're all girded up and prepared, even if it's a more controversial thing. It's like why parental rights went over really well in Alberta when Danielle Smith announced it. She had talked about the AGM, she had done some press on it, and eventually, once she did roll out, nobody was like, "Whoa, I can't believe you dropped this bomb on us."
Yeah. I'm just gonna bring up here. Here we go.
People heard my very creaky chair as I leaned forward to click on the watch.
I'm sure my viewers are used to background sounds like that. Sometimes I get them cleaned out of the videos. Oftentimes they don't get cleaned out. But here I have brought up a recent poll. This is from last year, May 19th. And this is from Research Co., one of the main pollsters in Canada. And it was asking Canadians' opinions on particular moral issues. And there's a lot of them here in this, but we're going to focus on this particular one here. Abortion. And this is actually a well-asked question because it is just acceptable or wrong. There's no middle ground, who flew. There's no somewhat agree, somewhat, as Wyatt says earlier. I don't think those are very good questions, and you put somewhat. It's in something like, it's a black and white issue, it should be black or white. Do you like this guy? You like them or you don't.
Yeah, either you have to work your butt off, and the whole survey has to be about that issue, and it's very detailed, and almost every single variation of the question has been asked to know exactly what people think, or it has to be the emotional impulse. When I bring this up, what's your main emotion? Not, well, I'm pro-choice on Tuesdays kind of stuff that you get with other pollsters where it gives you no information at all. And that's how you actually get a lot of these statistics showing, 85% of Canadians are pro-choice. Not really. You got to ask deeper questions. But a more simple question like this is saying, what's your reaction to just the topic? Morally right or wrong? That's when you get people being a little bit more honest.
And one of the things we're seeing with these, and I'm going to show a couple polls here now. This is the most recent, or this is the second most recent one, but I think it has the best question in it. And notice here, for the 18 to 34 age group, 37% think it's morally wrong. And then you go up to the 55 age group, it's 28%. And the 35 to 54, it's 29. 35 to 54 and 55 plus are pretty similar overall. That might just be noise between them, but this is statistically different.
And that's the funny thing, is social liberalism in a very overt way. Well, actually, almost not an overt way, but in terms of, like, if you talk to that voter, they're very, like, please don't say anything socially conservative. That's actually much more of an older voter thing. Younger voters, you get the hyper-progressives who are progressive, but younger voters tend to be the ones who, because they, consume a lot of content online and they're not reliant on CTV news to get all their political debates, they tend to be more open to, like, pro-life issues and discussions.
And then we're going to go to the most recent poll. This is from Ledger. And I don't actually like this question because it's somewhat strongly. Like, again, as we just touched on, I think that skews people's favor and not in a useful way. But another thing worth noting here is the same trend still pops up. 18 to 34s are significantly more opposed than 55 plus. And this favor column is also quite strongly polarized too. And then as a final one, we have Ipsos here. This is from 2022, just after Roe was banned or overturned. And once again, we see a very similar trend here. 18 to 34 is the most opposed to abortion, and older groups are less opposed. And the support is also quite shockingly different here. 63% for 55 plus down to 50% for 18 to 34s.
Yeah. So in the context of Justin Trudeau and now their strategy of having every single MP bring this up in the House of Commons and start trying to create skirmishes over it, the problem is that even when you take the worst polling on it, what they're doing is making their party significantly older by focusing on issues that are more polarizing in their favor with older generations. It's already an old party overall. The Liberals do really well with the 55 plus crowd, disproportionately to how they do with people 35 and younger. They are also middle-aged voters don't like them either, but 18 to 29, it's usually conservatives, then NDP, then Liberal. And by doing this, they're going to have even more moderate on the fence younger people just say, oh, well, I guess the conservatives are my party.
And the thing I will note with this too is not only does we have this trend now, and I will note that chronologically speaking, this is the oldest poll here, and this is the best one and the second most recent. So this is the numbers I think are actually more valid. But as they continue to stump on these issues, not only does it not actually help them, as we can see, like objectively, quantifiably, every time you roll out an abortion attack on the conservatives, their poll numbers are not improved by it, because as we touched on previously, it is already a polarized issue. Everyone who strongly cares about abortion is already not voting conservative. And in the case of Canada, where we have the Liberals and the NDP and the Bloc and the Greens, who are all pro-abortion parties, just wedging people against the Conservatives doesn't actually bring them to the Liberals, because there's 4 other parties they could pick to vote for.
Also, again, when you start going through more detailed polls of what do you think about this practice, what do you think about that practice, that's when you realize it's like actually not a decisive issue at all. And that's why if the Liberals thought, based on their experience at the doors and how people react to their campaigning, if they thought that this was an issue that was a big vote getter for them, they'd always be running ads on it. They wouldn't be kind of leaving home base, striking out, trying to pick a duel with some conservative NPC who does better, and then go back into hiding. If they were winning on this, they'd keep hammering it. Oftentimes they do it for a little bit, and then they sort of go back to their hole, because they're just trying to please the super hardcore, like pro-abortion type voters, and then they're trying to make sure that they don't alienate anyone else. Because when you look at the actual different abortion practices polling, a lot of people don't like sex selective, they don't like late term, they don't like a lot of these different things. And so that only proves that really there's a big group of people who, if the Liberals go too crazy on the rhetoric, like voting against making it a criminal penalty, like an increased criminal penalty for making a pregnant mother miscarry by assaulting her, that is what makes a lot of moderates turn into people who are becoming a bit more soft pro-life voters.
Yeah, I don't have this data offhand for Canada, but I have seen it for the US. And obviously the US is a different country and has different positions on politics and stuff, but it's worth noting that in the US, if depending on how you ask your poll, you can theoretically get around 60% of the population saying they somewhat, to some level, support abortion. Then you dive into it, and a majority of the population supports banning it after 15 weeks, which is more aggressive than any state in the US prior to Roe being overturned. So, as Wyatt is saying, like, on a headline, you might look at this and say, oh, 53% support the Liberal position, and that might help them. But then you dive deep into it, and it can be a lot murkier than you think it is. And especially, again, because this is already a very polarized issue, so the people who actually strongly care have already self-spread. Or what's the word for it?
Self-selected?
Self-selected, that's what I'm looking for. To the parties they want.
Well, this brings me up, or brings me to the anecdote I was telling you before the show, that the funny thing too is that even when you talk to Liberal people on this issue who think this is toxic for conservatives, even just by the way that they describe the current landscape, even they're basically demonstrating that it's not a good issue for them, because they'll come to you and say, well, 80% of Canadians are somewhat pro-choice. And it's like, well, I could literally reverse that and say 80% of Canadians are somewhat pro-life. So that's why it's a stupid issue too, because it's not like a 50-50. 50% are solidly on this side, 40% on this side, but you can grab up this 10% in the middle. That's a good issue. That's a good polarizing issue when there's people to win in the middle. The problem is that everyone has their own very unique perspective, and one anti-conservative abortion messaging campaign is not going to grab up the people that you think it is. It's probably actually going to polarize a lot of people, seeing that you're a little bit too rabid on this issue, because what always hurts kind of pro-abortion politicians is that when they push the idea too much, people sort of look at you strange and they're like, why is this something that you care about this much? Because I thought this was supposed to be something that we weren't supposed to talk about too much and wasn't supposed to be a big deal. And when you make it a big deal, that's when you turn a lot of people off. It's actually like when you look at LGBTQ polling, young people as well are actually the category who get really annoyed with pride type rhetoric and events. Even though you'll find the most hyper progressive people in the young Zoomer generation, you'll also find the most people who are tired of it in that same generation, because when you really intensify an issue to a group of people, people actually start walking away from you and doing the exact opposite of what you want simply because of the intensity.
As an example, this episode has this broken down by generation quite cleanly here. You look at just Gen Z versus millennial on the topic of abortion here, and Gen Zers are 8% more opposed and 3% less supportive. So that's itself quite a large difference.
People get more conservative as they get older, as a general rule. So the thing is that is going to shift. So they're more pro-life than they were at any other generation at this young age, where if you polled millennials 10 years ago, should be permitted whenever. That would be not just 53%, probably would have been 57% or 60%.
And there's also a thing to consider with a lot of issues like this too, and this is really true with easy to see something like Trump, which we'll get on in a second. But if your party's tanking, your leader's unpopular, and there's all sorts of really big issues that are affecting the country, and then all you want to talk about is really divisive, uncomfortable social things like abortion, you are actually going to negatively polarize people against you. Because if you're a young person in Canada and you're looking at things and be like, I can't afford to buy a house, and then all the government is talking about is how we have a right to abortions, and it's like, okay, great, but I don't care, I want a house, but that's all they talk about. And then it's gonna make people think and reflect and be like, what? Is this our priorities? Are our priorities really abortions over anything else? And as soon as people start retroflecting on things like that, then their positions can change on the issue. I'm not saying it's going to make them necessarily become pro-lifers in a moment, but it does cause their position to be reevaluated.
And this is exactly why we're transitioning now to Trump, is that Trump, when you poll him among Canadians, who do you support in a race, Biden or Trump? Or do you like Trump? Most Canadians are pro-Biden, really hate Trump's guts. But the problem is that when you actually don't live in the U.S., you have a much more passive hatred for Donald Trump, because it's more so you watch a lot of news shows, you watch Jon Stewart or John Oliver, all the Johns who don't like Trump, and you're like, oh, he seems like a bore, he sucks, whatever, something racist. But the thing is, you don't actually have your own solid opinion on him past just kind of passively consuming what Americans think, since you don't live in the country. So when Justin Trudeau then tries to use Trump as a wedge issue with Poilievre, saying Poilievre's like Trump, look, they both use the word wacko, and that's how shallow it literally is. They both use the same language, that people, because they don't have a solid opinion of Trump, but they do have a solid opinion of Justin Trudeau and don't like him, he's just artificially making them be like, that Trump's a swell guy.
Okay, so I have data here to expand on this. So this is Pew Research poll, one of the better pollsters in the US, and it was polling in Canada who has confidence in Trump, which is basically the same thing as saying who your favorability of Trump. And Trump's favorability was 25% in 2018, with 39% opposed. Now, this isn't strictly speaking easily to convert to vote intentions, but you can kind of get the idea here. 2018, he wasn't very well liked. And then once you come, wait, that's the wrong poll. Well, I'll pull up the other poll in a second, but what's worth noting on this, while I research the other poll here, is Abacus data back in November, or wait, April? I don't know. At some point.
You're right. Wait, no, you're not right. No, I think you're right. April.
They asked this question: who would be the better candidate, Trudeau or Poilievre, to deal with Trump as president? And overwhelmingly, Poilievre won this. Now, Poilievre also got about 43% in this poll overall. If I scroll up and find it. Where is it? Yeah, you got 44%. So you could argue only conservatives think he's going to do better, but when the conservatives are 44% of the population, that's a pretty valid thing to say. And Trudeau basically has his approval rating worth people think he'd be better at dealing with Trump. So when Trudeau's being like, Trump is so terrible, he's like, Poilievre, it doesn't actually say anything. Because the only thing that people care about with Trump in Canada is how he's going to interact with Canada. No one actually genuinely thinks Poilievre is Trump. At least no one who isn't a blinding partisan. No swayable voter actually thinks that, because it's obviously not true. They are
6,000 doors I knocked on. I had one guy saying, well, I used to be a conservative, but I think Poilievre's become too much like Trump. And I even asked him, well, in what ways? And he basically just told me to screw myself. So I don't feel like that's a genuine opinion. It's more of an artificially taken on opinion.
Yeah, because you look at like just superficial things. They talk very differently, very different vocal patterns. Trump's actually quite memeable in his vocal pattern, and oftentimes you see satire of him go fully flat because his very obvious and distinct speech pattern is not parodied, and it's like, how are you failing at this? This should be easy. But anyways,
every time you see someone do a Trump impression, it's like they're doing like a Winston Churchill impression. You can't just talk like a jowly New Yorker. That's really not what it is. But I had some people in some videos that I was making think like, they're like, stop attacking Trump, and I'm like, because I called Trump a character. I'm like, but he is. That's the reason why it's so absurd to compare Trump to literally anyone. Like, I'll even see conservatives, the like very capital P progressive conservatives, be like, no, he's not like Trump. Trudeau's like Trump. It's like, no, none of them are. Like, there's not someone in the state of New York. The closest person to Donald Trump is like Anthony Scaramucci, and even that guy is still like a ballpark away.
Apologies, I'm just trying to find the poll I was looking for. I grabbed the wrong one earlier.
Also, just looking back at some of the previous elections that Canada's had with Daniel Smith and especially Doug Ford. Doug Ford's a great example. They tried to deploy the Canada's Trump thing on him constantly in the 2018 race and even somewhat in the 22 race, but they'd kind of learned their lesson by that point. You can't fearmonger that someone's like Trump in Canada because everyone thinks that you're just basically manipulating them, and nobody switched voting just because Doug Ford kind of had a similar sort of personality to Trump, like being more pugnacious, but even that didn't really line up very well, and that's the problem. Trudeau's trying to use a failed play against Poilievre, and he doesn't even exactly look like Trump. At least Doug Ford kind of has the same body type and kind of like boisterous kind of personality.
I can't seem to find this poll, unfortunately, but the
Sorry, we'll take your word for it if you generally know what the results were.
The results were that the U.S. or Trump's approval rating has increased. His disapproval is about the same as it was in previous polls, like in this 2018 one in Canada, but his approvals are up. So as time has went on, either because people have started to like Trump, or just as my opinion is, the Liberals continuing to try to use Trump as an attack against conservatives in Canada has actually negatively polarized conservatives in Canada to like Trump. And that wasn't true before. In like 2016, conservatives in Canada did not actually like Trump in any significant fashion. And at this stage, they're increasingly more likely to like Trump, because what you see, and again, this is negative polarization here, is if you take, say, Poilievre, who's broadly really well liked among conservatives, very high approval ratings among conservative voters, and then you say he's like Trump, he's terrible, he's the worst person ever, he's Canadian Trump, then you have people who really like Poilievre be like, but I like Poilievre. Wait, maybe Trump isn't actually that bad of a guy. And they reevaluate their opinion. Because that's the important thing I want to stress here, is people's opinions don't change unless something causes them to reevaluate their opinions. Now, People who are more humble in their worldview might just need a piece of data and then they'll reassess their opinions. People who are more prideful might need to be punched in the face by reality to reassess their opinions. Depends on who you are and your personality.
Well, that's why sometimes in Canada it takes multiple elections to actually get rid of an unpopular government, because people tend to not like to think that they voted the wrong way last election, so they tend to vote that way a few times, and then you'll bump into a lot of these people. Oh man, but he just got bad in the last couple of years, or like, oh well, he did that, and that's what turned me off of him. I'm like, there's a lot of things he did exactly like that previously. You're just choosing now to start caring about it because you didn't want to feel like you were giving in to Scheer or O'Toole in the 2019 or 21 elections. Although I understand people not voting for O'Toole.
And that's the big thing with a lot of these things. That's quite important to know. Like any kind of wedge issue you deploy, any kind of like attack like this, like what I'm going to call non-traditional campaigning, because a traditional campaigning is like you're taking an issue and saying you should vote for me because I want to do this. That's like traditional campaigning. Any of the non-traditional campaigning things, you have to be very clear before you start who your target audience is, what your target goal is, and then what you're actually trying to achieve with this. Because a lot of times, parties don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. This is going to sound very prideful by me saying this, but it is what it is. I'm of the opinion that a lot of people who are in campaign management or campaign leadership, especially at high levels like federally in Canada, like the Liberal Party, they don't actually know what they're doing because they don't spend time critically and analyzing their failures. Oftentimes, these people will go upwards because they lead successful campaigns, so they think they know what they're doing.
Well, a lot of them I find it's like if you were looking up their Dungeons and Dragons real life stat sheet as communications people, they're really good at crisis management. The problem with that is that so many of them are terrible at actually generating good new ideas. They're only good at maybe, stopping bad ideas from coming up. So they end up just being people who say no all the time, but they're actually not very good at understanding how to deploy a communication strategy. How do you reach that middle class woman who doesn't really want to talk about politics, but you just need 5 seconds on an advertisement on television or on social media, or even 5 seconds at the door, that's going to maybe get the person to change. And they've never thought of that in their lives. It's like in the UCP campaign in 23, and I picked on them before, and I'm going to continue. I probably helped save a couple of their candidates by like forcing them to actually start running local social media ads. I'm like, I know the party's spending money provincially, but when you spread that money out, they're basically spending nothing in your area. Even if it's $100,000 they're spending over the 4-month period they've been doing it, that means they're only spending like a couple bucks a day in your area. So we actually dropped significant money. But the UCP campaign was just sad. They would go to people's houses and they would just be like, oh, are you voting for us or the other guy? And they would just say, oh, well, we're not voting for you, or we are voting for you. I'm like, oh, okay, and then walk away. And if the person says, oh, I'm undecided, like, oh, well, do you need to know anything from us? And it was like, oh, they didn't have a campaign strategy. These are the issues that you bring up at the door because they're the types of things people want to hear about. I always hate whenever I hear campaign managers or any campaign advisors or staffers saying, well, you got to go out there and survey people on what they want to hear. If you're within a year of an election and you don't know what people want to hear about, I'm gonna rip your head off. If you're surveying people a year before an election and you don't know the 3 issues that the vast majority of people want to hear about, you're actually just gonna make yourself look like a putz by going around and asking them. You almost seem out of touch by having to ask.
And worth noting with that too, because I also very dislike hearing people say that, is the literal job description of being a politician is to sell ideas to people. We have this weird narrative nowadays where the politician's supposed to listen to voters and do what they want, but usually, especially in representative democracy, the intention is that voters aren't necessarily required to learn and read up on all these things. They just need to be well read and learned enough to understand arguments and pick the one they think is compelling. So what that means is if you're asking voters what they want done, they'll tell you something that's bothering them, but that doesn't actually mean that's the thing that bothers them the most, or that's actually the real problem, or that's actually the thing they need solved. Because that's not what we're asking them as part of the social contract in voting.
Sometimes you hear from people when they describe really skilled politicians, they almost act like this person's like a magician or they have some access to a form of alchemy that just makes them connect with people easier. You don't have to be the most charismatic guy in a race to be able to go to somebody and say, "Hey, well, I'm not sure if you think on the issues, but I want to do this, that, and the other thing." And you like would like, is that on generally on side with what you'd like to see? And that's all you need to do. It like honestly, it sucks that I'm having to run in a nomination because it's like pulling teeth getting people to vote for you because you're requiring them to basically have to go and apply to vote, which is obnoxious. It's not just like, hey, vote for me when the general election comes around, but it is so easy to just for me to go up to people and on my three main issues on parental rights, immigration, and taxes. That's going to get a big swath of people. And you pick issues where even if the person disagrees with you, they're not going to get, or even an issue where you just the way that you present it, they're not going to say I'm out of line with you on that point, so I can't vote for you. It's just the marketing of presenting your ideas as the most reasonable thing you've ever heard in your life, and it's absurd that people don't believe this. Like it's almost a bit of play acting a little bit, and it's not something where you got to be again. You don't got to be a big extrovert. I'm super introverted, but just coming up to somebody and being able to say, "Hey, here's the reasonable things we got to do. Are you on board?" That gets so many people right away. You don't have to listen to them for 10 minutes and all their troubles and whatnot. You want to approach somebody as if you're their friend. At the same time, you're not there to just talk about the weather because people know what you're doing when you start doing that.
Yeah, and that's an important thing. I think a lot of people miss on this is, and we always say this too, like these are leaders, the leader of Canada, and then you see politicians or campaign managers or surrogates going for them doing the opposite of leading. You'll see like O'Toole and what he was doing, he wasn't leading. He was not leading the Conservative Party. He was going to focus groups, he was going to polls, he was going to all these other groups and asking them what they wanted to see, and he did it. That's not
That
leading.
was honestly what I heard Scheer's problem was in the 2019 race. He's actually somebody with some fairly hard opinions on a lot of issues. He's a fairly outside of his leadership, very good politician as a conservative. He was horrible as the leader, and I don't think I'm being insulting by saying that. And I think you'd agree. It's because all the time he was nervous, not knowing what to say, because his team was so insistent that wait for the focus group survey to come back, wait for this poll to come back, and then we'll figure out what to say. So he's constantly sitting there, terrified if he says something that's going to contradict the research that's going to come up. It's like you can't do that. People aren't going to see a survey come out and say, "Oh, I didn't realize I'm on the 40% side of this issue, and 60% of people are on the other side." No, people like that's not how people think. That's how people think when you have a vote and you figure out where people are falling down on an issue. But people don't literally show up and vote because I believe this on this issue and this on this issue. People, like we always say, vote on vibes and they vote on trust. And there's like, I think you brought this up in one of the first episodes. George Bush pretty much was behind on every single issue in the 2004 presidential race behind John Kerry. John Kerry was more trusted on pretty much everything except the literal question of who do you trust more to keep you safe. And that's where George Bush did like 10-15% better.
Yeah. There's actually another good example of that too in the 2012 U.S. presidential election. Obama was taking heavy hits in the polls, and his campaign team, because his campaign team actually were pretty decent, they looked at all the stuff that was getting hit on, and he was getting destroyed most heavily when immigration was talking up. So their new campaign strategy after the first debate was as soon as immigration comes up, just do anything in your power to change the conversation topic. And that proved very powerful. And that's a big issue that a lot of these, you see like the O'Tooles in this world have, and then the liberals right now, is they see an issue that's bad for them, and then they just don't know what to do with it. And in the case of the liberals right now, is not only do they have no answer to things like people feeling bad about the economy or people not having a house, not only do they have no answers to that, they actually have nothing to redirect to. There's no portfolio they are succeeding in. There's not anything you can pick in Canada right now.
And that's the thing with abortion. It's not like they're succeeding on the abortion file either. It's just a thing. It's just an issue.
You could even say, technically speaking, if anything is happening, they're losing on the abortion issue.
Yeah, because the maid honestly has hurt them on just life issues in general.
Mm-hmm. And it really just shows that there is, at a certain point, a government like this is just screwed. There's nothing they can really do in about 17 months that can do anything on this. Like, what are they going to
It
do?
requires way too much outside help, and we keep seeing the rumors. Oh, Trudeau's going to be asked to step down in 60 days, and Mark Carney is going to take. He's not. Mark Carney would do worse than Justin Trudeau in an election. It's not what people conventionally think because they're like Justin Trudeau's unpopular, so replacing him with this kind of mild-mannered economist would be a good idea. Nope, no, because he doesn't even live in the country. Do you think that when people freak out about Andrew Scheer having American dual citizenship, that hurt him pretty badly? Do you think that it's not going to hurt Mark Carney even harder that he hasn't even lived in Canada for like 20 years? It destroyed Michael Ignatieff, and he was literally just over the border. It wasn't not literally across the sea in the UK. And Mark Carney, when you look at all the polling on the different hypothetical leadership candidates, all of them poll terribly. The person who polls the best is Chrystia Freeland. And it's not because she's liked, it's because people are like, I recognize that name. And they'll pick her in the poll just because, it makes you feel smart thinking, oh, yes, I think she would be a very good leader replacement for Trudeau. And if you really dug down, it's because they don't know any of the other ministers.
Yeah, it's. And there's also a bit of naivety to those arguments. It's like, oh, all they had to do is change the leader and I'll fix everything. Because it belies this idea that the reason why the Liberals are losing is just because Trudeau's name or his personality, which might sound persuasive to people who really don't like Trudeau, but most people don't actually care that much about Trudeau. The reason why Trudeau has a negative approval right now isn't because people are like, I really want to punch Trudeau in the face. He's like the worst guy ever. He's awful. No, they don't like Trudeau because the government sucks. You can't have failure on every single major issue: housing, crime, drugs, the economy, etc. And then people like you. That's just not how that happens. That doesn't.
And people can't counter by saying, well, the PCs in Alberta were able to replace Stelmach with Redford, then Redford with Prentice, and so on and so on, and now Kenny with Smith. But that's the issue with that is that the UCP or the PCs previously, it wasn't that they were failing on everything. It was usually that there was this corruption issue, or that 30% of the matters that the government were dealing with that they were bumbling. But the rest of it, people were fine with. They were stable governments. Kenny, you could argue, was probably the worst example in terms of people viscerally hated the things he was doing across the board, and he hadn't been delivering on a lot of stuff. But for the most part, Redford, Stelmach, they're just kind of boring capital P progressive conservatives. They're spending more on social programs because they think that it doesn't, like, the economy's strong, we can spend however we like. And so whenever people replace them, they were looking for, better fiscal management, or we want less corruption, or we want more movement on this. It was never like the Trudeau Liberals, the position they're currently in, where people are like, I detest the actual fabric of your policy book entirely. Not that people think of them as a policy book, but in the sense that they couldn't think of anything in their minds where, well, he's done that. And that's where Trudeau is leaning harder and harder into very immaterial issues like tolerance for LGBTQ people, at the same time that he couldn't even bother sending a MP or an official to actually walk a Jewish boy to school who was getting rocks thrown at him. Like that's the thing too, is they're not even good at the social issues because the groups of people they're trying to please do not agree on them. So they're trying to reach out to voters in minority communities who don't like Israel, or progressive students who don't like Israel. At the same time, they're doing the whole LGBTQ tolerance thing that just makes them look completely hypocritical in the minds of any middle class voter who actually cares about the things the liberals pretend to care about.
Okay, so I found here, after some searching, the last Abacus poll that poll questioned other people. This is back April 30th, so very recent poll.
And this isn't the approval. The good thing you brought this one up, because I saw the other one where it was like, do you approve, disapprove ones. Those ones were fine, but it didn't really tell you if crunch time was happening, who are you voting for in the leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is all Canadians, current Liberals, and accessible voters, and the only 27% would prefer Freeland. That's not good numbers. Like, if even if we assume, and that's of Liberal supporters.
And I think the bigger thing too here is the accessible liberals. It drops 5%. People who are thinking about voting liberal, there's a big drop off for people in the mood for it if Freeland is the leadership candidate.
And then you see some other names that I think these are mostly just names thrown out by like quote unquote election Twitter. But you have like Anita Anand or Fraser or LeBlanc down here, and they're
Fraser, I
piddling.
understand actually putting here, and I think it just demonstrates that people think he's a horrible housing minister and a horrible previous immigration minister because they were really pumping him up as, oh, he's the new expert that we're putting in charge of housing. Oh, he knows his way around a file kind of stuff, and they're kind of playing him up as like Trudeau 2.0, like, oh, look at this tall, attractive man who's going to take over the housing file and push forward a new progressive plan to save us all. And it's like it did not work. It did not pay off. People associate all of these people with their performance on their files, or they don't know who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and that means that they don't like any of them.
And I'll just note here, especially on these bottom four, who are 4 or 5%, there is a general principle called, I can't even a proper name for it, in polling, that if you ask a question, usually about 4% of the population is either just bats or lying to you or trolling you. And by
Yeah, like you ask them 5, 6 names, and they're like, I don't know any of these people. They click 5, and then they hang up.
the principle's named after, it's like what percent of the US population believes like the lizard people. It's the lizard people thing. It's the lizard man constant. Like no matter how many times you poll this, whenever you do, about 4 to 5% of the U.S. population will say lizard men rule the world,
Yeah.
which is either means 4 to 5% of the U.S. population is literally insane, or they're trolling the pollster, or they're just randomly pressing buttons. All of these are very possible. Well, except the they're literally insane part. So that
So
means
when you actually interpret the polling results through that lens, even Christian Freeland and Carney are probably only well liked by maybe 15%, 9%, depending on the person, of actual Liberal Party supporters. And most people are just like, I know that name, or they're just clicking a button.
yeah, like these bottom four, like you can't distinguish this 4 to 5% from just zero support. And you could also say margin of error and stuff like that as a factor as well. But when we have this obvious thing in polling that pops up that's not just margin of error, it's just malicious replying people, or just again people who just have no idea what they're doing and just saying yeah.
And I would say if you throw Greg Fergus in this poll, he'd probably be doing as well as Joe Lee. Has nothing to do with his performance because he was like a backbencher before he was the speaker. But you now know the name.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're polling on leadership, just becomes name recognition. That's scary. Because Polyev, honestly, before he ran for leadership, was decently well known, but it wouldn't be a household name if you went door to door. You'd knock on 25, 30 doors. Probably one person knows who he was. If you're a conservative, you definitely know who he was. If you're on social media, you do. But no, people didn't really know who he was. When the polling started, it was because this guy announced and he said this, that, and the other thing. I really liked that. And they were selecting him in the polls that way. So like conservative nominations or leaderships have actually been pretty decisive in terms of the polling doesn't just sort of go to, Charest is well known and this person's well known, and then it becomes all the also rans that people don't recognize. It tends to be more closely to where the factions of the party stand. So, like, that's where this is not representative at all. It demonstrates that there's no Liberal Party factions at all. There's just people. There's just names, and it's just how many times you hear that name a year, and that's pretty much the frequency we have. Plus, again, when you have the 4 or 5% for Fraser and LeBlanc and Champagne and Anand, that's really also just pulling the fact that somebody must live close to their riding, and they're like, well, he's either my MP or he's in the region, so I'll pick that guy.
Mm.
Because my MP, Ron Liepert, if you're outside of the city of Calgary, and even frankly, if you're outside the southwest of the city of Calgary, you don't know who he is. But if he was on the leadership ballot, he would get 2% of the vote or in a poll simply because there's enough people in that area of Calgary. If there wasn't another person running right next to him, he'd probably grab what Scott Aitchison ended up getting. Like Scott Aitchison, that was purely just a candidacy that proved that some people in British Columbia know who he is.
Yeah, and I just brought over some other numbers here. So this is just by the province breakdowns, and I just find this really funny because Fraser, who should have more name recognition in the Atlantic than the rest of the provinces, still languishes in fourth place.
But yeah, it proves it's just purely regional.
Yeah.
And then you get Champagne does better in Quebec. But his problem is that Jolie is Jolie also from Quebec? I think
Yeah, she's from
Montreal, right?
Montreal.
And that's what's boxing up Champagne there. And then Anita Anand, is she in Quebec too? Wow, why is
No,
she doing
she's
15?
from Burlington, I think, or is it Oakville?
This is just proving people are lying.
I don't.
I think it's probably because that she has such a low vote overall support that it's probably if two people said that they like her in Quebec, she's at 13%.
Yeah, could very well be something like that because this is accessible liberals too, which is not a very large number of people. So
Yeah.
it's a very small sample of a small sample. But yeah, so the overall thing is like none of these people are very well liked. And actually, one of the things Wyatt just touched on, I think is an interesting way to interpret a lot of the liberals here, is the liberals are obviously a left wing party. Uncontroversial opinion, I know. Uh,
No,
and
it's a center right party. They don't do the things that the NDP want.
and the conservatives, I think, this will be controversial. The conservatives are a right wing party. Crazy. Um, and as I've touched on in previous videos, I think it was one of my BC videos. If I think about this later, I'll put a note on the video card or something so you can click to it. But I touched on one of this before that left wing and right wing parties have very different structures to them. The left wing leadership and left wing parties are more of a consensus. Like it's picture like a committee versus the right wing parties like a corporation. So you have the CEO, then you have the VPs, and then you have the other people below them. And it's hierarchical, semi-rigid, but it's like different departments that are very clearly different. You have the SOCONs here, you have the moderates here, you have the libertarians here, you have the generic conservative.
And that's where
here.
you can even run like a Derek Sloan in the 2020 race, and even though nobody knows him, he actually tends to poll pretty well because the SOCONs are like, that's the guy, and then they start selecting him, even if they maybe don't know anything about him.
Yeah, he was a nobody zero-term MP who was elected for like 3 months and pulled 15% of that race. Solely because he was the guy in that column. Whereas the liberals, since they're more of like a committee, or the left, which usually tends to more of a committee-based collaborative approach, there isn't actually clear sub-factions. Since there's no clear sub-factions in the liberals that are coherent and rigid and organized, there is nothing there. It's just popularity.
It almost just turns into, I'm at least thinking about the NDP, which it does things a little bit differently than the Liberals or behaves differently. And that's what's interesting about the Alberta NDP leadership and then the leadership between Jagmeet Singh and Charlie Angus back in, was that 2018 or 19?
I think it was 18.
Yeah. And so that really a lot of NDP leaderships, from my perspective, they break down to party stalwarts versus new people. So Jagmeet was the new guy in the sense that he signed up because they just do a raw vote leadership with no points for different ridings. That Jagmeet Singh just signed up a lot of Sikh voters in Burnaby and Mississauga and Brampton, and that's how he overcame Charlie Angus, who Charlie Angus is what you would call the stalwart. He is the trade unionist NDP guy who's been around for a long time, and that's exactly how it's breaking down the Alberta NDP leadership race right now. It's the stalwarts behind Sarah Hoffman, hey, you're not part of our club, get out, Nenshi. And then it's Nenshi signing up, frankly, a lot of new retirees who are like, oh, I don't like Danielle Smith, and I like that he used to be mayor at some point, even though no one can really defend his record that well. But that's what a lot of NDP leadership races become. But then liberal leadership races are just coronations. Are you going to be in favor of the candidate we're trying to coronate, or are you going to get like pushed off to the side, or at least prove you could get 7% of the vote, and I guess we'll give you a ministerial file? Because like the 2013 liberal leadership with Trudeau was like pathetic in terms of the lack of people actually running.
Yeah.
For a guy who had never actually done anything important in office. But they see their leader as the vehicle for the party, not a vehicle for a set of ideas.
Sorry, just looking at the previous elections. But yeah, that's pretty much what it. In the liberal leadership style, the leader is like, sorry, the left wing leadership style. The leader isn't a guy running the show. It's just this is the figurehead of the party. The actual Quebec Solidaire does this very obliquely and overtly. They're not even the party leaders. They're the co-spokespeople. We have Dubois or Nadeau Dubois and some other person. I think it's.
And they always have
right
a woman and a man acting as the leaders. Like we can just sum it up this way: they're communists, and so they're trying to do some like hyper equity type way of operating the party. That there's not even a single guy with the power; it's actually completely equal between the two sexes.
And I think that's the best example of the different structure and how these parties work, and that actually leads to poll questions like this saying, how do you support people in the party? This is actually pretty meaningless for a liberal party. Because there is no internal factions that are coherent and strong. They're actually very homogenous in the left, because usually on left-wing parties, as soon as it's not homogenous opinion in the party explodes. That's how we have the NDP and the Greens, and as two fully functioning parties that win seats in Parliament. But we only have one right-wing party that wins seats in Parliament. Because the left-wing parties, as soon as there's a division, they have irreconcilable difference, and they're just going to make another party.
Yeah, which is also back to our episode on why the Liberals and the NDP don't join together. There's a reason that they're not the same party, and it's not arbitrary. Someone stepping into the room and saying, "Why aren't you guys together?" isn't going to make anyone suddenly think, "Oh yeah, we could just combine and beat the Conservatives," because that's not the motivations of NDP voters.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a really fun example of this in Canada. And these are micro parties, but you have the Marxist-Leninist Party and also the Communist Party. And they split because one's like a personality cult. And the other ones are like, no, we can't be a personality cult. We're communists. The idea of a personality cult in a party that gets like 0.2% of the vote is just hilarious to me.
Yeah. Well, honestly, that's why you actually end up seeing in a lot of by-elections in ridings with higher amount of like ethnic minorities in it, that you get a lot of independent candidates, because there's a lot of guys who on their block, they know that there's 70 households on their block, and that's 300 people, and they better see that they have anywhere between 200 and 300 votes on the by-election day, because people are almost taking count for their community power so that they can sell that vote to another person later on. You're proving that you have a lot of clout, basically.
Makes sense.
Also, there's a lot of real estate agents who do it just as a way of promoting themselves.
And this leads us into another related and interesting topic at hand, which is BC United, the BC Conservatives. Merge? No. It's silly. They shouldn't merge. It doesn't make any sense, really. And one of the reasons why it doesn't make any sense, which I will hopefully pull up on a poll here momentarily, just to give an example of this, is the BC Liberals, the BC United, is not a conservative party. Crazy, right? The former Liberal Party of BC was not a conservative party. And the reason I say this is we actually have data on this. Boom. From the last Ledger poll on BC, which this dates back to March, so it's a little old, but it's the last poll that actually has this data. And you look at the actual people voting for BC United as of March, and to give you a note here, the headline number is 18% for BC United, which is higher than it currently is in more recent polls. But 25% of federal Liberals are voting for BC United. 3% of federal NDP are voting for BC United. 24% of federal Conservatives are. So it actually draws more left-wing voters than it draws right-wing voters.
And again, a lot of those right-wing voters are more so there not because of a love for the party, but it's more of just the habit of knowing that BC Liberals and now United were the non-NDP party. And what you'll notice, too, is that the BC Conservatives in the latest polls are winning young voters. they're actually they're beating the NDP with young voters, not just the United. They're beating like NDP with young voters. And older voters tend to be people who obviously watch a lot more legacy media, mainstream media, which means that they're going to be the people less likely to know about what the kind of current conditions of politics are in British Columbia, and knowing that the BC Conservatives are not just that party who happens to have the Conservative name but never really does anything. No, it's a real party now. And so the thing is, you're going to get a lot of those federal Conservatives who are older voters realizing, oh wait, we can actually have exactly what we want in this election, and they will shift pretty quickly because younger voters are on social media more, which means that they're more likely to know if they're politically active, to know about the updates going on inside of politics in British Columbia. And so this is where, even when look at that, if you go back to that poll again, look at the NDP and look at how many Conservatives they're still relying on.
Yeah.
15%.
And I'll note too with this is not 2021 voters. This is current March 2024 Conservative voters. So that's 13% of people who are going to vote for Poilievre are split ticketing NDP in BC right now, which is quite a bad number for the BC NDP, just on a side note, because in reality, those are likely all going to divert to the Conservative Party.
There's unreconcilable differences, and this was before or like right after David Eby started picking fights with Poilievre. Do you think that people are just going to have it just be just some sort of like remaining contradiction in their head, that I'm going to go vote for David Eby even though I'm going to vote for Poilievre in the federal election, and they are literally 100% opposed to what each other are doing? That's just not something that's going to hold up. The same thing with the United, though. With United also opposing Poilievre on things like parental rights and being flat-footed on their position on the carbon tax, which is a driving issue in this BC election. Obviously, we are going to see the Conservative vote start consolidating behind the BC Conservatives. And the great thing is, and this is a theory that you and I have talked about behind the scenes a lot, and I've been trying to coax people into understanding, because a lot of people do get won over by these merging vote split narratives, is that the United are going to hurt the NDP worse than the Conservatives.
Yeah, so how do I want to phrase this? I definitely agree. I think what we're going to see here, I'm just trying to also do two things at the same time, probably not the best plan, but whatever, is I think the BC United is going to continue to have voters on October. They're not going to go to zero, so we can just take this numbers. I would say, at minimum, 14% of this 24% are going to go to the Conservative Party. Most of these BC NDP voters who are Conservative are going to go to the Conservative Party. So in the end, I think the Conservatives are going to get 90 to 95% of the people who are going to vote for Poilievre in BC. And since that's like 45 to 55% of BC, depending on the poll right now, that isn't itself probably competitive, not winning.
And but here's the thing too that should be concerned that people need to know when interpreting this poll. One, this is back when the Conservatives weren't even doing as well as they are now, but this is what percentage of that federal vote is going to what party. And in this poll, this Ledger poll, I believe it was close to 50% for the federal Conservatives. So just saying, but the NDP is grabbing up 87% of the NDP vote and 69% of the Liberal vote. Yeah, both of those parties combined are not even 40%, because the Greens, remember, in British Columbia actually grab up 8 to 9%. Federally speaking, they do decently well. And another thing, it's a very small little data point here, and maybe it doesn't really matter that much, but other is getting 2% of the federal NDP vote. I think that what you're going to see, and you'll get a lot of people, you're going to get a lot of NDP voters who are going to be too nervous to vote for the provincial NDP party because of just how over their skis they are on a lot of these like radical policies about drug decriminalization and SOGI. They're going to vote United, probably, because they're too nervous to vote Conservative because, you know, John Rusted and Poilievre, they're radical. But they'll go vote for Kevin Falconson and basically burn their vote because they just don't want to give it to Eby anymore. And that's what we see in like the Main Street poll, where when you actually ask people who are decided, I know who I'm going to vote for in October, those people are around there. I think it was 40% of them are voting Conservative, and only 34% of people are voting who are decided we're going to vote for David Eby's NDP. It's a lot of soft support going for David Eby, that he's going to win anyways. Why not vote NDP in your riding? Because, you know, at least you'll have an MLA who's an actual member of the government. Whereas that's not really a thing anymore, so people are going to shift hard.
Yeah, so just brought up the most recent Ledger poll here. Now this one's from April, and 50% in BC are voting for Poilievre federally. Now this one here is from March, so there's a month difference, so these numbers are going to change a little bit, but that's probably just going to mean it's better for the Conservatives in BC. Because if 50% are voting Conservative federally, well, even if these ratios are intact, that's still quite substantial. That means in the realm of 6% of the NDP vote is federal Conservative voters right now. And the idea that that's going to stick there seems pretty outlandish. Same thing with this 24% with the BC United. Especially if as many people speculate that Poilievre might campaign with Rustad in the election in October or do a couple rallies there. If that does in fact happen, you might even see nearly 100% of this consolidate behind Rustad. In which case...
and I don't doubt that Poilievre, as this provincial election comes closer, is probably going to openly back John Rustad, because it's going to help him federally to lock up the province if a BC Conservative government gets into power and they start basically implementing some of Poilievre's agenda on the provincial level early.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if you're Poilievre, you kind of want a lot of these crazier left-wing premiers out of your way, because just as Conservative premiers can sometimes stymie Justin Trudeau's agenda, same thing happens in reverse, where David Eby could just reject enforcing federal drug law and basically say we're just going to continue coasting along, not actually enforcing bans on smoking meth in public. And that's where he will probably want him out of his way as like a very key left-wing domino to get rid of on his way to the prime minister's office.
I think the only reason we haven't seen Poilievre really do anything overt yet is he's just waiting to see who, if it's a contested election, and B, who the main opposition to the NDP is going to end up being. And if, as things are going, I'll just bring up the overall polls right now. The three of the most recent polls all had the BC Conservatives leading, and then two more of them had them at over 30%. Only this one Research Co poll since April has had the NDP with a double-digit lead.
And 18%, and this is where you do have to bring in a little of social data into your polling analysis. NDP are not 18 points ahead. You don't get that impression on the ground. I make videos on the current state of BC politics, and there's not a lot of people showing up to basically say, hey, screw you guys, Conservatives suck, I'm voting EB. Obviously, I'm a Conservative channel, but when a party's really far behind, you get a lot of more naysayers, and I don't find anybody. Plus, also, I can kind of read the room on the news I see coming out of British Columbia, as well as we looked at that previous poll that came out about British Columbia showing like 78% of people think EB's doing a poor job on like several issue fronts that are like the key issues of the election. That's not something that can really stand over time.
Mm-hmm.
That 78% of the people think you do terribly on drugs, on the carbon tax, on crime, and they're like, but I'm still going to show up for you. Because I think what we're going to see is that the NDP is going to significantly underperform its polling.
One of the things I've been looking at too in this regard, I'll just bring up is it this poll? No, it was. I can't bring this one because that is paywalled. We'll bring up this Abacus poll. No shade against Abacus. I actually think Abacus is a good pollster. But you see these numbers here for like the interior north, and Abacus has a 2-point lead for the NDP. And I think that's probably genuine, honest sample. Nothing wrong with this. I don't think there's a world where the NDP will finish +2 over the Conservatives in BC.
I think that's just what you would call like polling inertia or like election inertia or whatever, political inertia, is that there's just enough people who remember voting NDP last election. They're like, NDP, because they think about it as, do you like the NDP? Or at least do you still spite the provincial Liberals, and will you say NDP in this poll? And that's probably what that's reflecting.
What I actually think is reflecting is, because Abacus is a online pollster. And if we go here, we look at Palace. This is a telephone pollster. Notice that Palace actually has a 14-point lead in the rest of BC for the Conservatives versus a 2-point for the NDP. And what I think is happening here, and we see this in Alberta too, and this is what actually makes Janet Brown a really good pollster. It's something you can only really do with telephones. The people who sign up for an online panel are disproportionately not deep rural voters. And when I say deep rural voters, I don't mean like the colloquial term people might say like, oh, you live in a rural area, and then you're like, oh, actually you live in Lethbridge. It's like, well, it's a small city.
People who on their like when they're having a coffee break in their office don't just start filling out ledger polls because, hey, look, I can get some points and gift cards. People who own a farm don't do that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if people understand this. When you own a farm or you're a small business owner, you don't have time to pop to the back to try and make yourself a $5 in terms of Starbucks credits. That's a very middle class, white collar, if not government worker thing to do.
And with this, there is, I'm trying to pull up the data here because I have it somewhere, but the deep rural areas are like 90-10 conservative federally. And I think
some of the most conservative ridings in the entire country.
Mm-hmm. So what I think is happening here,
the Christian Heritage Party comes second place in some of those ones.
What I think is happening here is these voters are not getting captured in a lot of these polls because they don't answer online polls, they answer telephone polls. And that actually skews the data a lot. So yeah, okay, I have the numbers here for Alberta. I'll just pull it onto the screen. So this right here, this is my categorization of the ridings in Alberta in 2019 and 2021, or the precincts in Alberta, excluding Calgary and Edmonton. So just the rest of the province. And notice here, like farming communities, the Conservatives got 86% of the vote here, federally. Even under O'Toole, which did poorly, it's 70% and then another 12% for the PPC and then another 4% for other, which is usually, in this case, Maverick/Christian Heritage. You're looking at like 90% of the vote in these communities are going to conservative parties, and even like remote communities, which are like not farming but still very rural. Very similar trend, small towns. Yeah, this is Alberta. I understand this isn't BC, but you see this trend, and this is true everywhere. So we'll pull out another one I have here that's actually done up.
And again, even in British Columbia, it's actually a bigger lead often because these are not just rural communities. Like, honestly, there's actually a big difference between America and Canada, but then you can find more cute examples between different areas of Canada. Like, Canada tends to have a much more religious rural population on the average, where I find you get more kind of, America, don't tread on me flag type people in rural areas in the U.S., but like a lot more rural voters are like, Reformed Calvinists and Congregationalists. They're not very loud, but they vote a specific way for a reason. And they're not going to be like, well, who's the people who can take on the NDP? They're just going to vote for the most conservative option that's realistic.
Just bringing another example here in Nova Scotia, you look at federal or provincially in 2021 here, about 30% of the vote went conservative. In the rural areas, 40% went. The rural areas voted 10 points to the right of the province at large, which is a pretty normal thing. This happens quite a bit. So what I think is going to happen here is this is just a skewed sample because of the sampling bias of the methodology. And now there's also sampling bias against telephone polls have. They don't capture young voters quite as well because they're less likely to answer the phone. But that's another topic for another time. As I think we'll see here is if the Conservatives are at 34% overall, they'll be getting like 40-something% in rurals. 40, 44. Possibly even more. And that'll probably end up meaning their poll numbers get skewed up because they'll probably stick at 34 and 31 in these Vancouver and Vancouver Island, but gain 8 points in the interior, which means they might gain 2 points nationally or province-wide, if that makes sense. In other words,
I think this is also
you might see something like this.
I don't doubt a lot of this is also even affecting places like Metro Vancouver, that the Conservatives are probably underpolling in some of these areas simply because when you make it that general of an area that you're getting your sample from, and you're not trying to be specific about what parts of Metro Vancouver, you're going to get a lot of downtown Vancouver people answering the poll rather than people who are, suburban workers in construction and plumbing and own small businesses. So that's where you always have to make sure that you're not just getting the most easily accessible office workers, which tends to be why so many polls in a lot of provinces end up cutting out conservatives, because even conservatives in cities don't vote or don't work in lines of work that allow them as often to be able to pick up the phone or answer an online poll to say who they're going to vote for.
Yeah.
So in Vancouver, I could see this being a race that's probably right now not probably tied based on the recent polling and where the conservative momentum is. I don't think that this is a race where the only people who actually care to vote conservative happen to live in rural areas. I think that there's going to be a lot of a suburban middle class backlash against the drug policies of the NDP and a lot of the other stuff affecting their day-to-day lives. Because if anything, they're the people most affected by a lot of David Eby's policies. You can't tell me people who are familiar with East Vancouver are happy with David Eby.
Indeed. So what I think we're gonna see here is, I think, something like this in BC. And what this, or I'll rephrase what I'm saying here. To circle back to the main question at hand here, does a merger make sense? No. And the reason why a merger doesn't make sense, just to reiterate this, make it very clear, is we both suspect the Conservatives are going to gobble up almost all the federal Conservative voters, which means the United is going to just have some Liberal voters and some NDP voters stuck with them by inertia. Either that, or they're like the Liberals who don't like the NDP because federally that there's Liberals who don't like the NDP. Obviously, the two parties are different. So by merging them, you actually get rid of that option that people can park their votes in or they can vote for that's not the NDP. And then they'll just likely end up voting for the NDP or not vote. The best case scenario for the Conservatives of the BC United not existing is they take this 24% and then this other 3% and this other 25% stay home. That's the best case scenario. But
when you're the Conservatives and you have the most motivated voters by the polling, you want it to be a bit of a messy race for the left.
Yes. And we actually have more data on this too. I don't know if I can pull it up here. I don't think I have access to it offhand. But Abacus ran the numbers for this. And if a merger occurred and the BC United disappeared, he had, in the most recent Abacus poll, the BC is at 13%. He had 6% of them vote NDP, 6% of them vote Conservative, and then 1% just disappeared. They stopped voting. Which meant that the merger did nothing. It just pushed people to vote NDP. And those 6% who voted in BC United, who then voted Conservative, I contend, are going to vote Conservative anyways come October.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about just the merger politics that have been going on in terms of the discourse, because I found it so artificial that it was even being floated. I don't tend to believe in the people are conspiring in order to hurt the BC Conservatives and this is some sort of op. But that if anything was an op, it would be the idea of Brad West, the mayor of Port Coquitlam, coming out of nowhere and saying, "Oh, I'd like to lead a merger party," and then Kevin Falcon suddenly coming out saying, Kevin Falcon obviously has motivations to get inside a merger party between the Conservatives and United because his party's utterly broken right now. But Brad West coming out and floating the idea that I can run a merger party or lead a merger party with a stupid name that won't win for you guys, and then within 3 days he's like, "Oh, never mind, I'm gonna go vote NDP." It's like, wow, it's almost like this was purely just to try and create some sort of a buzz about, oh, the Conservatives are too weak to win, they need to merge, and that they didn't merge, and now we're just going to have news coverage about how this could have been a big missed opportunity for the Conservative Party. It's not. So much of politics is about projection of confidence and merging. On top of the fact that a merge party would be this weird in the middle party that would appeal to anybody, but also it would just demonstrate that John Rustad lost his nerve. And it doesn't matter if a new confident leader comes in, it just feels like such a retreat.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to one of the things we just touched on earlier in the podcast, which was politicians are leaders. One of the worst things you can do if you are the leader of something, that you have a leadership position, is to break confidence. To tell people, no, actually things aren't doing good, that's not good. Now, at the same token, you don't want to be like what the Liberals are doing right now and say, no, everything's fine. Look at this report from an NGO that says everything's fine. When people don't think that's fine, you don't want to be there either. But if you are in a situation where the people are happy and you're the leader, you don't want to tell them, no, everything's scuffed. We're screwed. And saying, oh, we need to have a merger 5 months before an election day, and I have to retire as leader and have some other random guy become the leader, that just betrays the most lack of confidence ever. It's a negative confidence thing. If that were to happen, this prospective merger, and Brad West led the party, I would contend not only would they get less than the combined vote share, they would get less than, I think, 60% of the combined vote share of the parties right now. Because a lot of the the provincial conservative voters who are voting for Rustad right now would just evaporate. They just go home. Be like, well, we had a chance, and then they lost their nerve.
And the thing is, people, it's just one of these political myths over time that either you're merged or you divide and there's a vote split. And it's like we said, again, I keep saying like we said in previous episodes, but like we said in previous episodes, people vote for the party they want to vote for. And merging doesn't make people throw up their hands and say, well, I guess I'm now captured by this party because my party merged into it. Like, I contend that the merger between the UCP and the Wild Rose, or the PCs and the Wild Rose, did not actually make a material difference to getting rid of the NDP. People stopped voting NDP because they did not like them. If, frankly, Brian Jean just stuck in as the Wild Rose leader and Jason Kenney went in as the PC leader, PCs probably would have won most of Calgary, and the Wild Rose would have probably won most of the rural areas, and they would have just been into coalition government where arguably each party would probably be more honest about what it would wanted, rather than everything just being muddled in the background, and then it becomes an internal war between, are the PC factions going to win or the Wild Rose factions? Because if anything, that was a very silly way of doing it that just created the risk of another merger or split in the future, simply because now we didn't actually deal with the problems. We simply merged to forget about them.
And that's actually, you see that too, that division, it's fading over time now, but federally, the Conservative Party still has that cleft of the PC and the Reform voter. Now, I think that's really more of a divide that pre-exists, that only exists among voters pre-2003. So if you weren't voting before 2003, you probably don't have that mentality. But the people who existed back before then, and were voters back then, still have that mental image in their mind, that the PCs and the Reform are different parties. They're two wings of the party, when in reality, the actual party itself doesn't cleanly split into Reform or PC wings. It's more fractal. There's all sorts of different other factions that override them. But voters still think that way. And that doesn't change, because people have brand association, they have opinion association, they have habits they build up. And just merging two parties doesn't homogenize that. It doesn't turn that soup together and make everyone happy.
I brought this up on my own laptop. Like, we don't need this on screen, but this is, I think, proves it pretty well. In the 2015, in the Alberta election, the NDP won 40.62% of the vote, Wild Rose 24.2%, and PC's 27.7%. Obviously, the Wild Rose still did better in terms of seats by a wide margin over the PCs, just simply because they dominate in rural areas, but then just have problems breaking into Calgary and Edmonton. But when you go to 2019, the UCP got 54.88% of the vote. It was a big wave election, but they really didn't win that many more votes than they had combined, and then each party combined did in the previous election. But really, what happened was just the NDP lost votes. They went from 40% to 32.67%. So even if the party stayed split and they got the exact same percentage of the vote that they had in the last election, they would have won the election anyways, even if not one of them made any gains whatsoever. It's because people just didn't like the NDP. And it might have just been in 2015. It wasn't that you guys were split. It's because nobody liked either of you. Because actually, the Brian Jean made a lot of mistakes as the Wild Rose leader, where he tried to make his the Big Tent PC party as well. So we had two Big Tent PC type parties running against each other, and that meant that there was just a lot of Wild Rose or stalwart PC voters who just stayed home because it was just confusing. It wasn't a vote split issue. It was an issue that each guy lacked confidence in their own agenda and then basically ran on nothing. You could say, well, that's technically a vote split. That's just incompetence. The vote split is the symptom.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting just on the topic of the Alberta election. So in 2015, the PCs got 413,000 votes. Wild Rose got 360,000 votes. But in 2012, the PCs had 567,000 and the Wild Rose had 442,000. In other words, both parties lost in the realm of 100,000 voters from 2012, which really just tells you, as Wyatt is saying, the people didn't like those parties. They lost a lot of votes, just straight up. They went away.
Yeah.
And then by 2019,
it's not that their unity had then overcome the dragon that was the NDP. It was that the NDP just fell apart.
Yeah, what I would describe it as is Kenny motivated the people who stayed home in 2015 to come back out.
Yeah.
And that motivation isn't because the party united, it's that he ran a better campaign in 2019 than Brian Jean and Prentice did. Turns out campaigns matter.
Yeah, and that was the thing in 2015 is there was like far too much squabbling between the Wild Rose and the PCs over trying to win the exact same disillusioned NDP PC voters, and so they were basically both running Aaron O'Toole style campaigns where they were tacking towards the middle in order to win voters who had already been taken. And then they ended up just losing a lot of voters on their right flanks who assumed that, okay, well, let's just wait for these two corrupt parties to fall apart and we'll figure out things out afterwards.
And that's really the main lesson to be had with a lot of these things. Be it merging parties, be it wedge issues. Voters want the party to have a platform and an opinion and a brand that says something, has a plan to solve the problems that are existing right now. And a lot of times, you see the parties who are failing. They're not failing because they're split. They're not failing because they're not merged or they're out of line with the morals and orthodoxy of a country. Usually, it's just that people aren't sold by their plan. Why are the Liberals failing right now federally? People aren't sold on the Liberals' plan. Doesn't seem to be working. Why did Notley lose 2023 in Alberta? They weren't sold on Notley's plan for Alberta. Why?
And notice how, too, that as the Liberals are falling down, the NDP is not then rising because they're inheriting and splitting the vote with the Liberals for their progressive votes. It's that those progressive voters are either still sticking with the Liberals or the NDP like they originally did, or they're staying home now, and then some blue Liberals are coming back to the Conservatives, but even that's kind of not really an actual type of voter. It's mostly just people who didn't vote last time, probably considering that they're going to vote Conservative this time, and a lot of Liberals have just checked out. Plus, also something on the vote split myth is that look at the results for any federal election. There's like 30 parties that run. And to my knowledge, they're not really splitting the vote with anybody. And you can say, well, there's not a big name behind them. And if you put a big name behind a party, that's when it starts splitting. Saskatchewan United, probably going to do 3%. Doesn't matter who takes the helm of that party. Doesn't matter how much they take in money. People know that the race is between the Saskatchewan Party and the Saskatchewan NDP. There's nothing that's going to make the United become a party. Same thing with BC Liberals changing their name to United. that people, it doesn't matter if it has all the MLAs behind it, people don't want them anymore. It's like people want steak in their chicken sandwich, and you can't trick people into thinking that they want that by dumping tons of money in marketing. If anything, that's probably just confused people more. The sheer amount that the United have been spending outside of an actual RIP period, just promoting the fact that they still exist. If anything, it's making them more pathetic. And if they shut up, a lot of people probably would just have come back to them if they just changed their name silently back to the Liberals.
I just find that name change. I think people really overblow it too much. I don't think it actually mattered as much as a lot of people think, but the rationale behind it is just hilarious to me.
It's not because the name change hurt them. It's more that the fact that you even thought to change the name is symptomatic that you're losing. That
Yeah.
It's more so that you are already failing, because if you pull people off, it's the Liberal Party or the United, it basically pulls the exact same. The Liberal name gives them 1% more, not much. People didn't trust them. They changed their name rather than fixing the problems, and they're surprised that the problems still remain.
What it really belies is that the party brass and BC United thinks voters are dumb, and everyone sees that. Because the only reason why you would change,
It's literally a party for consultants. Consultants who think that, oh, you just got to send out this new marketing email format we have, and it's going to get a lot more people to click on it.
because what it really tells voters is it's like, oh, we don't think you're going to vote for us because you don't like the federal liberals. But it's like, what? You're a different party. People know you're a different party. They might get confused every now and then. That doesn't mean they think you're the same party. The only time
NDP governments get elected across the country in different provinces, despite the fact that the NDP only has a chance at maybe 3 federal seats in that entire province.
Yeah. And a lot of the cases, too, where say, federally, the NDP brand might hurt the provincial parties, say, like Saskatchewan, the parties could run away from it pretty easily if they wanted to. They just don't, because the leadership base of the party isn't that dissimilar from the federal leadership. But, like, in the case of BC United, when it was back to the BC Liberals, if they wanted to run as an honest-to-goodness, normal conservative party, they could have. And that wouldn't have confused voters. The people are like, oh, yeah, just the provincial Liberals are different. That's what it is. Because we kind of see this in Nova Scotia. Now, the provincial Liberals in Nova Scotia are aligned with the federal Liberals, which does hurt them in some regard. But the federal Liberals and the provincial Liberals are very different parties.
Well, didn't the premier out in Nova Scotia actually back Axe and carbon tax? She's like softly on board, or is that Newfoundland?
That's Newfoundland.
Who is this? Tim Houston.
Tim Houston's the PC guy.
Oh, never mind. Yeah, I'm not from the Maritimes, as people can tell.
But, for example, Stephen McNeil, when he was Premier of Nova Scotia, ran budget surpluses. He campaigned on running budget surpluses. He fought the unions to try to dissolve public sector unions or break them up into smaller things. Like, these aren't things the federal Liberals under Trudeau would ever do. Period.
Because the environment's different and those things are attractive. And just as 90s Liberals are not 24 Liberals, like 2024 Liberals. And that's kind of the problem with the Liberal Party federally, is it's actually an oddly ideological party. At the same time, it's a party that just follows the leader. And they're ideological because they follow the leader, and Justin Trudeau is convinced that if he pushes his progressive messages far enough, that they'll become popular when people don't want just orthodox liberalism in government, like modern orthodox liberalism. They want, balanced budgets. They want lower taxes. It doesn't matter if you define yourself as a liberal, you want those things.
People don't want ideological solutions to problems. Now, your solution might need ideology to explain it, but they don't care about your explanation. They care about the result. And if the result sucks, they don't care if your explanation sounds good. And that's really the problem there, right? Trudeau, as you put it quite well, is running a very ideological position, very ideological campaign, very ideological party, and voters are like, okay, cool, you do that, I can't buy a house. what gives?
That's where all the tolerance messages of Justin Trudeau walking through a pride parade and talking and releasing things about how Poilievre's against gender theories, like that's such a out of the box issue in a bad way. People see that, they're like, what? Oh goodness, he's talking again.
It's like, yeah, great. Woo, marching that pride parade, but
Yeah, those gay people can't afford homes.
I want a house. The amount of people I know in my personal life who would never vote conservative but are considering it because they want a house is just mind blowing. Like, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but based on what I've surveyed in my personal life, it would not be outrageous to me if Halifax voted conservative in 2025. Just because of the amount of people I've surveyed who want to be able to buy a house, who can't, and are considering conservatives because the current government isn't doing it. Which is just crazy. Why are you voting conservative? I want a house and the current government sucks.
And the key thing here is you don't need people to understand John Locke or Adam Smith to vote conservative. If anything, this sounds so strange as maybe to say on this channel, because I know you do a lot of stuff on what conservatism is, but I always find that in a certain sense, it's always toxic for people to get a little bit too much into quoting old conservative authors, because it's almost completely immaterial in real life when you're talking to somebody to bring up old philosophers. When you're explaining conservatives to conservative people online, or conservatism to conservative people online, wanting a little bit more background info to the sort of belief system that they buy into, that's good. But when you're actually talking to people who are struggling with real life issues, they don't care what Edmund Burke or Milton Friedman said about an issue.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of just goes back to the main gist of how you should tackle any campaign. It never should be about, we're doing this because that's what ideology says. If your reason boils down to, we want to do this because this book here says we should do that, you're gonna lose voters. If you're saying, okay, we need to do this change because this change should let us do this. Let's say, for example, we need to cut immigration because fewer people needing houses will make it cheaper to build houses cheaper. The regular voter will be like, oh, I can see that. I can understand that. I can engage with that. That makes sense. If you start quoting like economic supply and demand, like high level, like not even high level, but like university level economics to them, they're just going to be like, what? What is your point? Get along with it. Come on. I don't have all day. And this isn't to say the average person can't understand economics. It's that the average person literally doesn't care what your jargon is. They don't care what your reasoning is. They care what your plan is and what it should do.
Well, that's where it's so silly for the Liberals to be going after like Poilievre. He has no plan. Nobody actually cares what the plan looks like in detail. I mean, he does have a plan. He's just not putting it in wonkish policy, a policy master's program kind of a way of, here's my 50-page report on how, like reducing the wage subsidy for these big corporations and then lower taxes are going to help the economy.
Yeah. In a lot of regards, I find a lot of media people, both new media and old media, and just commentators in general, have this really wonkish view of things. Like, they want an economics dissertation on what your economic platform is. And it's like, if you don't have that, you have no plan. But it's like, the average...
This sounds rude, but this is why I don't want the Canadian Taxpayer Federation ever on my channel. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about how much Trudeau spent on some trip, and then you guys have calculated it. Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, voters don't care about those level specifics. They want you to say, I want to do this, and it should do this. And then after one term, if you fail at that, they'll fire you and put someone else in charge. Because at the end of the day, the average voter, like, if you think about the actual game theory the average voter is going through here, they don't know if you're telling the truth. They don't know if the other guy's telling the truth. They don't even know if you know what you're talking about or anything. All they know is you're saying this, so they can evaluate if that's true. If you give them a really detailed economic dissertation, unless that voter wants to go and analyze your actual nitty-gritty government actions, they'll never know if you did that.
And again, it comes down to like what you were saying. It's leadership. They are looking for you to lead on this issue, not come and explain how your policy is actually very good if you look at it from these metrics. That's the thing too. Whenever you're having to explain economic metrics when talking about the healthy economy, it's because the economy sucks. You shouldn't even have to tell people the economy is good if it's good. People shouldn't even want to hear from you because they're too busy spending their own money that they've earned. They shouldn't. You shouldn't even come up into their day-to-day life. That was the great thing with Ralph Klein. People will go after him as like, oh, simple-minded. No. He was actually. It's very intelligent to just lower taxes, lower regulations, let people get along with their lives, and then leave them the hell alone. Because that's how your people are going to like you, and that's how people expect the government to act in the economy. Just making sure things don't go off the rails.
There's a good maxim in politics, which is if you are explaining, you are losing.
Yeah. And that's what I was thinking too. I was just applying it to the economic debate. Well, that's the thing with right now. Yet with the liberals is that they're talking about how actually our GDP is quite good. It's like, yeah, you imported 500,000 new people into the country for the last 4 years straight. Of course, the GDP went up. Even if you just shake the quarters out of people's like pockets, the GDP goes up, but the actual per capita productivity in GDP is down. And so it's so foolish for them to even try and push the idea that actually we're the number one in the world, if you think about it. It's like people don't feel that way, so it doesn't matter.
Yep. And the other thing with that, too, which it makes it even worse for the liberals and anyone using this kind of argument, is, let's say, for sake of argument, Canada was number one in the world on per capita. So, like, all of our peers were in an economic depression, but Canada was going like 0.5%. So 0.5% is still abysmal as a terrible performance. Doesn't matter if everyone else is in economic depression, losing 80% of their GDP or something crazy like that. Canadians don't actually care what happens in Switzerland or Germany or Brazil. Doesn't matter to them. If they're an expat from one of those countries, they might care a little bit, but 99% of the population of the country is not from any individual other country, for the most part. So they don't care about that. So all they care about is Canada doing well? And if Canada's doing bad by Canadian standards, that's all. That's it. That's a wrap. You're done. Like, oh, we're getting 0.5% growth. That's better than the entire world. Okay, but under the last guy, we're getting 2% growth. Doesn't matter.
That's why it drives me up a wall when people bring up inflation. They're like, it's a worldwide problem. It's like, okay, one, doesn't make it better. Two, no, it's not. It's just that a lot of governments around the world all did the same stupid policy. And that doesn't make it somehow okay that you guys also printed 40% of all currency currently going through the economy in the last 5 years. That's still on you. It's not like Joe Biden forced you to do it because he has a bigger economy than you. That's not how any of this stuff works.
And in fact, actually, I'm not an economist, so correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the comments who's an economist, but my understanding is if the U.S. is printing a bunch of money and we don't, that actually makes our economy more competitive to them. So it's actually slightly better to not print the money. We're not talking huge differences here, but it's the same. It's the inverse logic of like if the U.S. raises their interest rate, we have to raise ours, because if theirs is more, then capital will flee Canada. It's like the inverse of that logic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's some pretty nitty-gritty economic stuff there.
Yeah, eventually, like, healthy economies will attract more people. There's a reason why there's differences between the provinces in Canada. And it's not just that, well, our economy's down because PEI is down, or our economy's down in Alberta because Ontario's bad. Like, no, there's been periods of time where the Ontario economy sucked. And everyone was moving to Alberta because Alberta was doing fantastic, even by American state standards. Yep. Even when we have to follow federal regulations, if we just do enough other stuff well, then we can like kind of fix the imbalance that the federal government is creating.
Yep. With that, though, I think it is a good time to wrap up the video here. So if you guys enjoyed the video, go down to the comment section below, comment, and make sure you press like and share on all those other YouTube things. And with that, we will see you some other month with another one of these great podcasts. With that, we bid you adieu.